Hello, everybody, and welcome back to the Napoleonic Wars podcast. And we are once again talking about the United States of America. This could be our fifth or sixth episode, kind of dedicated to America by now. But even then, rather embarrassingly, we've only just reached our second president. You can accuse us of a lot of things, but you can't say we don't go into detail. So today, as I say, we've reached president number two, John Adams, who occupied that position between 1797 and 1801. We were supposed to have started his presidency last time, but again, in true Napoleonic Wars podcast fashion, we ended up just discussing the 1796 election. So today we have the task of actually talking about the 4 years that he was president for. Rejoining us today for that purpose is Sarah Georgini. She is the series editor of the Papers of John Adams, which is part of the Adams Papers project at the Massachusetts Historical Society. That means there is probably nobody else in the world who is as personally acquainted with John Adams than Sarah, because she literally reads his correspondence for a living. She has also written a book, Household Gods, The Religious Lives of the Addams Family. You can find that on the Oxford University Press website and in the link in the description if you're at all interested in the Addams family, not the one with two M's. Sarah, welcome back. How are you doing?
Hi, Josh, and hello to all of your wonderful listeners. I'm delighted to be back here because, as you say, I do read other people's mail for a living. And luckily, that includes John Adams. His presidency was like no other. So I'm delighted to talk about it with you today.
I typically at this point would say who I'm joined by, but today that is actually nobody. No Zach, no Luke, no Liam. So it's time to get into it. So for 8 years before becoming president, which we spoke a little bit about last time, Adams had been part of an administration which had again and again tried to avoid getting involved in the deteriorating diplomatic situation on the other side of the Atlantic. But in 1798, the US enters an undeclared war against France, which is called the Quasi War. Can you walk us through this infamous affair, the so-called XYZ affair that leads to this set of hostilities?
I want to take us to a moment right before John Adams finds out about the XYZ affair, because he is barely in office when this news starts to unfold, really, of how relations with France have deteriorated. And the moment I want to take us all to is his inauguration, March 4th, 1797. Women and men throng into Philadelphia to see it happen. And Adams has a moment of real dismay on taking the reins of the presidency. He says that as George Washington passes him and he moves to be sworn in, he looks out at the crowd and he can't tell if they're crying because they're sad Washington is leaving or they're happy that he is arriving in the top seat. And I think this moment tells us a lot about how he approaches the first real crisis of his presidency, which is the state of Franco-American relations. He has barely been in office for a few weeks when he learns that our US Minister to France, Charles Cotesworth Pinckney, has been not just expelled by the revolutionary French Directory government, but evicted from the country. So this is a real insult. He immediately goes to his cabinet, who are kind of Washington's handpicked men he's inherited. And he asks them what to do. Should we go to war with France? Should we consider doing something about the Franco-American treaties of 1778 that we've held? How should we respond to this crisis? And they all think the same thing, more or less. It's a bitter insult, but it's not worth a war. So peace is still very much on the table in that spring, summer of 1797. Adams thinks of a way to turn this theory into practice, and he creates a peace mission that are three well-chosen Federalists who are going to support his ideology, more or less, on the world stage. So we have Charles Cotesworth Pinckney, again, headed back for more with France. We have John Marshall, who is a favorite of his. And we have Elbridge Gerry. And Elbridge Gerry is a longtime friend and an occasional thorn in the side of John Adams. But they are both Massachusetts men, and they're both Federalists. So the envoys head out with high hopes for peace in the fall of 1797. They are quickly ensnared in a fairly duplicitous labyrinth of French diplomacy. The French minister, a man named Charles Talleyrand, immediately sets forth agents who Marshall lists in his private journal as agents X, Y, and Z, who solicit bribes, and a loan from the United States before they'll even start negotiating the envoys. Now, what's on the table here is important because France has been kind of assaulting American shipping for some time. So they have a stack of grievances, the US envoys, from merchants, from people who've lost cargo and profits. France also has some complaints. Among the French complaints are the Jay Treaty, right, which gives kind of most favored nation status to the British, who they're currently at war with. And they have a few privateering claims of their own. So France says, we will not even negotiate until you start to pay these bribes. The envoys say, no, we will absolutely not do that. Pinckney himself says, no, no, not a sixpence. This is his retort to the attempts to French bribery. This goes on for a few months, and the envoys record how they are kind of taken aside one by one, how the agents work on them. Talleyrand is quite deft in sending people out so that he will socialize with two envoys at the theater, and while they're out, one of his agents will visit the third envoy at home. So you have all these little machinations that are happening. Talleyrand finds in Gary a vulnerable soul. He finds someone he can isolate and kind of bend with possible promises of peace to work against the other two. Marshall and Pinckney stand firm. They think that any solicitation, and bribery is somewhat legal and somewhat commonplace in this period, is a threat to United States neutrality. They don't want to do it. They don't want to bend. Gary feels a little more pliable, and he sees an opportunity to bring home a win for American diplomacy. He's not right. Talleyrand is playing him as much as he possibly can. So this kind of XYZ affair, as it's recorded in Marshall's journal and elsewhere, news of that comes when the envoys decide to leave by the spring-summer of 1798. And the idea that American diplomats have been stuck in this intractable web of French duplicity, all because they wanted peace, really breaks loose in the spring and summer of 1798. It's when Adams finds out about it. It's when the XYZ dispatches, so news from the envoys, is published. Congress finds out about it. And everyone begins to rethink the United States' relationship with France at this point.
And what is John Adams' reaction to all of this? I mean, he strikes me as quite a principled person from our last conversation. I can't imagine he's entirely pleased when he hears about this bribery stuff.
Mm. I mentioned at the top that Washington's departure leaves a mark on the American public. But as XYZ breaks, people are very glad to have a seasoned diplomat rather than a soldier at the helm. Adams really understands the courts of Europe. When he sees Talleyrand operate, he immediately thinks back to how the Comte de Vergennes operated during the Anglo-American peace negotiations about 10-ish years earlier. So he's not surprised, but he is irate. So he is irate but strategic, as you would hope a good diplomat in chief would be. And he immediately begins to think about how this information should be shared, who should know about it. He reverses himself. At first, he thinks people shouldn't know. Then he decides everyone should know, which I have to say is kind of a John Adams motif throughout his life. And so he lets this information go wide. He lets it sink in with the American public. And then he shifts it to create a domestic policy that will be extremely controversial, the Alien and Sedition Acts, to support his foreign policy agenda. At the same time, this idea of losing a longtime ally, of becoming frenemies with France, is just not tractable. It's something that he has to figure out how to fix, right? So he is between a rock and a hard place. There is a Jay Treaty to uphold with Britain, and then there's these pesky 1778 Franco-American treaties that no one has really been observing for a while now. And he has to figure out how to handle this at home, how to handle this abroad. He is someone who is, as I said, strategic. So he begins thinking in the back of his head about what to do. And then everything falls apart. In the summer of 1798, Alien and Sedition is pushed through, and we can talk about that in a moment. But his summer and fall, he is in Quincy, and Franco-American relations are the last thing on his mind. His correspondence falls off. He sputters out in terms of gathering counsel from his cabinet. And the reason for this is that he is ill, but more importantly, his wife Abigail is seriously ill. Everything else goes out of his head. He refuses to join Congress when it is meeting in the late fall. He sort of farms out work to his cabinet, and he distances himself. He goes into kind of a political eclipse in this period, just when he's really needed the most. So it's something that is high on his mind. And when he comes back full force, December, January 1798-99, he has a plan for Franco-American relations for a second peace mission. But he doesn't tell anyone, especially his cabinet.
Right, and there is no declaration of war for the Quasi War, which is interesting because I think it makes it almost quite modern.
Mhm.
But nevertheless, the scandal or the XYZ affair does translate into kind of maritime warfare. How does that kind of shape out in terms of aggression? I mean, with the Napoleonic Wars podcast, and I'm sure listeners would be interested to know about kind of the shape of that war, even if it was very much a kind of important for American domestic politics.
So Adams had last been around an American war when he served on the Continental Board of War during the American Revolution. And that was some decades ago. The world has changed a little bit since then. He is dealing with the mayhem of the French Revolution, with the Jay Treaty, with the onset of the Napoleonic Wars. And this period, as I'm sure your listeners can teach me better than I can ever teach them, is a pivotal one for Napoleon, right? So we have the Egyptian campaign, the Italian campaign. There's a cluster of activity where, and the British Navy is doing an excellent job at sea, whereas the French forces are good at holding swaths of land. So there's kind of a tussle there. Where does the United States fall between these two powers, right? Well, we don't have a lot of money in terms of funding a naval force, an armed force, ammunition, supplies. What Adams chooses to do in creating a Department of the Navy and in getting those 6 frigates that Washington promised actually out on the water is incredibly controversial because he leverages a national direct tax to do it. And so there's a lot of resistance to this. There's a lot of rebellion at home from people who are itching for war in one respect, but not itching to pay for it. So there's a lot of concern about how the US military can accelerate its growth in a very short amount of time. And of course, we're never going to be on par with the British Navy or the French Navy. I mean, the best startup military in the world would not be able to handle that. So Adams is kind of caught in this European war that he doesn't expect, and he has been long determined to stay out of this. And this is really where the Federalists lie. The Federalists think, let's be friendlier with Britain, let's maintain as much neutrality as we can. There's a rising opposition to Adams in the form of people like Thomas Jefferson and other Democratic Republicans who say, but what about France? Isn't this just the natural outgrowth of the French Revolution? It's going to touch all corners of the globe. And if we get involved, we get involved. But they're not thinking very practically about how we're going to be able to do that. As for the Quasi Guerre or the Quasi War, Adams reflects on it quite a lot more in his retirement than anywhere else. And I have to say, this is one of the perks of reading the Adams papers, is that sometimes you have to do a flash forward to understand what happened in the moment. In his retirement, Adams reflects on it as his just and necessary war. That's a very particular way intellectually of phrasing, right? It's a military historian will easily say, and I am no military historian, that a just war and just war theory has a certain long lineage of thought that he is invoking when he uses that term. It is, however, not a formal war where two navies are pitted against each other. It is awkward skirmishes, short, bloody fights. It is mostly in the Atlantic, around the Caribbean. It is privateers, and it is all these revenue cutters in private ships that are kind of tricked up with extra crew and ammunition for a while. They're kind of supercharged for the moment to go up against French ships. It's not something where there's super clear big turning points or battles per se. It's these odd little back and forths where people are seizing other people's ships. One of the things that is most challenging, I have to say, and hats off to all the military historians who do this, is tracking how many times ships are seized and then metamorphosed, so like their names change or their crew changes. I have such respect for the scholars who are able to identify this British frigate is then named this French frigate is named. It's amazing to watch. But I think the thing that I've learned the most about researching the Quasi War for our volumes for the papers of John Adams is how multinational these crews were, because a lot of in the Quasi War, because a lot of them have been living under the practices of impressment for decades, if not centuries. So, for example, the Constitution, the great USS Constitution, rolls out, and the first prize they happen to claim is a British ship called the Niger, which was originally a French ship, which has English credentials for privateering and a multinational staff that sometimes flies French or Spanish colors. So you can see how they got seized, but also how awkward is this? Our first big prize is allegedly our current ally. So this is a messy, awkward quasi war with quasi wins and quasi losses. And Adams himself, not being a soldier, sees in the quasi war an opportunity to put forth something he has always wanted, right? Which is a navy. He has always wanted these wooden walls of defense for the country. And so he sees an opportunity to accelerate military growth. How he chooses to pay for it is not so popular. How people learn about the Quasi War is interesting too, and how they're involved in it. So we have some really wonderful depictions of how people have this ramp up in military growth with cultural echoes. So they wear kind of glossy black cockades. That's how you knew you were a Federalist who supported this kind of thing. You have a lot of merchants who write in to Adams and to the first Navy Secretary, Benjamin Stoddert, and they offer their ships. And they say, actually, you can kind of rent this ship out and then you can have it back after the war. And for merchants, this is an opportunity to recoup some of their losses over the years and certainly to raise their stature as good Federalists and good citizens. So as with any war, there are opportunities. There are groups that move in to seize those opportunities. And there are political, I was going to say waves, but I won't make that pun. There are political currents, perhaps, to kind of follow as the war progresses. But it is mostly in the Caribbean, and everyone gets involved. When Spain is a forced ally of France, we're dealing with Spanish privateers too. You kind of didn't know what you were going to face. Adams does employ kind of unevenly a convoy system so that you have some kind of ships protecting and leading maybe 10 or 15 other ships. And this is briefly a tactic that's used. But the Quasi War really exposes the military weaknesses and the, I think, domestic needs of the United States, and in a way that Adams had been praying to avoid for a very long time.
Thank you. Let's follow those political currents or those political waves a little bit, because it wasn't just a foreign policy dispute. It also became a flashpoint for bigger political tensions at home in America. So how did the Quasi-War feed into American domestic politics, and particularly in terms of this rift between the Federalists and the Democratic-Republicans?
Mm-hmm. So there's a set of laws that arise in the early summer, and they're largely crafted by our Secretary of State, Timothy Pickering, and other Federalists. And these are the infamous Alien and Sedition laws. And they're directly linked, first and foremost, to events in the Quasi War and fears of domestic subversion, whether it's British and Irish refugees in upstate New York or French and Spanish spies on the western borders. There's all kinds of worries about foreign interference in American politics. So we have the Alien Friends Act, the Alien Enemies Act. These two give the president the power to detain or deport foreigners. We have a Naturalization Act that makes it harder for people to become full citizens. It kind of lengthens that time and raises the requirements in a very serious way. And then finally, we have the Sedition Act, which says, don't print, utter, publish anything that defames the government, the president, Congress. And so these laws are pushed through Congress. The Federalists champion them. Adams signs off on them in what is probably his most legacy tarnishing move, right? And the laws that are of that quartet, the law that most seriously rolls out is really sedition. And that is used to a great degree to target Democratic Republican newspaper editors who have begun to publish some of the roiling dissent about the direct tax, about our Franco-American relations, about how they think Federalists might be getting a little too chummy with the British all over again. And so these are things that, as laws, become weaponized, right, by political groups. And they're used very seriously. Sedition also plays on some of the vagaries of early American jurisprudence. So how a court is formed, which judge gets your case, all of these things are kind of used a little bit against them. Whether someone is in jail and they've served their time, but they can't afford to pay the fees to leave, so they just stay there. These are all things that start to really make Democratic Republicans, especially those South and West, which are borderlands territories to a great degree, that still have British and Spanish military presence, that have ongoing hostilities with Native American groups who already feel somewhat vulnerable. It also is something that makes them feel targeted. And so you see this growing rift between the parties about what kind of domestic agenda supports what kind of foreign policy agenda, and how does that actually affect me? And that makes people start to choose, I think, their party affiliation in a way they hadn't so much before. It really deepens that polarizing difference between whether you're a Federalist, whether you're a Democratic Republican. It was a little more negligible in the first decade or so of the country because we were just getting a government up and running. But now there's real differences emerging. And you have to remember that the Jay Treaty, when it landed, was pretty controversial. And people gathered together in town meetings, in committees, and expressed their dissent. They burned John Jay in effigy. So this is something where people feel they can be vocal about foreign policy, and they weren't heard, and now they're coming back for more. So you start to see these political affiliations harden. And this is going to be in the run up to the election of 1800.
I'm interested in the motivations for passing the Alien and Sedition Acts because with hindsight is 2020, but it had negative ramifications for the Federalists, really. So presumably in passing these acts, or there's perhaps an ideological element to it, but more than that, there's a very practical element to it. There's a sense of this kind of a national emergency that needs to be overridden. So I mean, to what extent was there this kind of sense of emergency, I suppose, that like America is fundamentally at risk and we need to take these like emergency measures to stop kind of sedition and to prevent kind of foreigners like subverting our nation. I suppose to put it differently and probably more dramatically, I mean, how close was America to some sort of other revolution?
So Alien and Sedition gets pushed through because people feel extremely vulnerable in the fragile new nation with a brand new constitution still. And if we look south and west, let's think about this for a moment. The British have recently begun evacuating their forts on the western frontiers, which they were supposed to do a while ago, but they are finally doing thanks to the Jay Treaty. We have another treaty with Spain, the Treaty of San Lorenzo El Real of 1795, which is usually better known as Pinckney's Treaty, but not the Pinckney guy who got evicted from France. Different ping ping. Um, but we have a very fragile relationship with Spain, especially in those south and western borderlands, and they haven't totally evacuated their forts. So settlers looking out from Kentucky, Virginia, Ohio, even Pennsylvania, it is a short ride before you feel like you are in foreign territory. And there's a great concern of invasion. There's one more thing as we think about the spread of the French Revolution and its impact and the Napoleonic Wars' effect on all of this American foreign policy, which is the absolute blaze of the Haitian Revolution that's also taking shape, right? And Toussaint Louverture, who's leading the charge, is incredibly adept as a revolutionary at using the rhetoric of the French Revolution and tropes of French citizenhood to move forward plans for Haitian independence. There is a great fear among Federalists, Democratic-Republicans, many in the South, that since Louverture has raised a Black army and crewed somewhat a Black navy, that they are going to invade through the South, or that the French can come down through Canada, through Detroit, and that these two forces will meet, and that will be the invasion of North America. So there's a real concern that is sort of egged along by spies, by informers, by the general public at times, by newspaper editors, that French invasion could be imminent. And that, to a brand new country without a real army or navy to defend its coastline, is terrifying. Our commerce has already been seriously crippled by international privateering, and it would be hard to raise the money very quickly to defend it. So I think that there is a feeling of national emergency in this period. Part of the emergency in John Adams' mind is to keep the peace. And so that is always something that is, how can I have a quasi war rather than an all-out war? Not a great plan, but better than a full-fledged military encounter. So I think there is that feeling of just absolute terror that everything we've just built is only going to last 20 years, that it's going to go away tomorrow. There's also a fear that America will fall because of disunion. Disunion happens thanks to foreign interference. So the idea that you kind of want to keep everyone together in some kind of consensual mode of making politics and organizing civil discourse about things that you disagree about, that is something that is very much, they're not quite there yet. It's something that they are very anxious to keep rock steady, which is the idea of union. That is just the great fear of the 1780s, 1790s, and well into the 19th century, that union could collapse at any time. Because when they look over to Europe, what they see are all these countries falling to Napoleon, right? So the creation of all those sister republics, the way he rips apart Italy, Switzerland, there is great fear that there will be a French invasion and then a forced signed peace treaty, which is no peace treaty at all. One other thing I would mention, just because it's a John Adams kind of quirk, he always thinks about the example of the Netherlands, the Dutch example. And currently, they are the Batavian Republic answering to the French Directory. And he does not want the same thing to happen to the United States.
Presented like this, there seems to be, well, at least for some people, at least a rationale, I suppose, behind the Alien and Sedition Acts. Most importantly for John Adams, obviously, they don't enchant everyone. What is this kind of reaction, both in the popular sense and I suppose from politicians as well, to those acts, both from the opposition and within John Adams' own party?
So Adams kind of gets ambushed by his second in command there, right? Thomas Jefferson, who helps with James Madison to craft the Virginia and Kentucky resolutions, which are kind of the legal criticism rejoinder to the Alien and Sedition Acts as unconstitutional, simply put. And this is also going to deepen the rift, right, between the parties and between the two men. What's interesting to me is that we have this major period of political and diplomatic crisis. And in the last book, the book that is sitting behind me in many stacks, which covers kind of this period from February 1798 to June 1799, I cannot offer for publication any correspondence between Adams and Jefferson. And this, I think, is a resounding silence. They're not talking to each other. Jefferson is working from home at Monticello for most of this period. Adams is often at Quincy as well, tending to Abigail or anything else, and then briefly at the seat of government later on. But there's no conversation, there's no dialogue between the two. And I find this always so troubling because I think, like, this was the opportunity. This was the moment where they could have really had a good hashing out of their different constitutional views. And I think it would have been really wonderful if they had. Do they have this conversation a bit later on in their retirement? Yes, absolutely. We'll get to those books later. But I think it's really interesting that as unpopular as Alien and Sedition is, Adams doubles down. He absolutely sticks with it. Is signing those acts his finest hour? Absolutely not. I will not give him a free pass on it. It causes a lot of heartache and distress for a lot of people. In the moment, I think he saw a larger global picture. And I do have to say one other thing about Alien and Sedition, because it doesn't totally come out of nowhere. Earlier on in the 1780s and 1790s, Adams, who is a lifelong student of government, who is fascinated with how politics and constitutions work in other places, he is much taken with watching the British sedition trials of the 1790s. And that just locks in his brain as, oh, this is an example to look out for. And I think a lot of Alien and Sedition that resonates with him, it's personal. He's a prickly guy. He's someone whom the press has attacked on two continents for at least 30 years at this point. So sedition has some appeal to him, that act. It has some kind of draw in that there is a punitive measure for people who challenge the government in ways that might be dangerous and actually bring it crashing down. So I think he thinks he's doing a good thing, but I want to point out all politics is personal. That's true for him too, and he brings that personal experience to it. I don't think that Jefferson had quite the same press attacks on him during his time abroad, and I think that shifted his opinion as well.
One person we haven't mentioned so far, and he's always in the background of this series, is Alexander Hamilton.
Oh,
Where does he come into this? Because I mean, it wouldn't be like him to stay quiet on an issue, would it?
so when Adams first begins to kind of canvass his cabinet, what we found is that there's kind of a group. So Timothy Pickering, Oliver Wolcott Jr., who's the Treasury Secretary, less so Charles Lee, who's the Attorney General, but definitely James McHenry, who's the Secretary of War. They take this confidential information from Adams that they are not supposed to be talking about, and they immediately run to Alexander Hamilton and say, what should I say? How should I reply? And in some cases, they actually take his phrasing word for word, like copy and paste Hamilton's homework into their own. And this is something that certainly Adams is aware of Hamilton's charisma, charm. He knows about his electioneering manipulations in the election of 1796, which I think we talked about in the last episode. And he knows that Hamilton has a bit of a hold on his predecessor. There's a wonderful line that Adams dishes out where he says, Washington had a master, and that master was Hamilton. So he knows going in of Hamilton's influence. Hamilton is a party guy, right? He wants to be a party chief. He wants to be the head of, a political group that has that much power. Adams is, and I think James Grant has a wonderful biography title here, a party of one. He is not interested. He thinks it's kind of beneath him or it's a problem for any president to really put themselves at the head of a party. He wants to be a disinterested public servant. Hamilton is not a disinterested public servant. He is ambitious. He is crafty. He is extremely good at math. He is someone who will wait until the last second to deliver an answer to something, and then he will absolutely drown you in statistics. I think we've all been on the receiving end of someone like that in a group project who just sends it at the last minute and you're like, I guess it's right. Like, and so this is the Hamilton kind of vibe of just drowning you in information, which is really well thought out, but he is so data driven in some respects, and in others, when it comes to politics, he just careens off the rails. So you never really know what you're going to get with him. And this is one reason why Adams is not so fond of him. He's not as predictable. He's not someone who, he can always bank on for stirring party support. Hamilton remains kind of a shadowy figure throughout Adams' presidency, dipping in and out with the cabinet, giving them information and acquiring a lot of information as well. When the chance for Washington to lead the new Provisional Army comes up, Hamilton is right there, ready to run things, and really tries to angle into a greater role that he gets in the end, and to really run the show as much as he possibly can. And Hamilton he's incredibly smart. He's incredibly well connected, especially thanks to his marriage, but he is in it for Hamilton. And Adams can't stand that. He certainly has some choice insults for him and his personality, which you can Google happily in the Adams Papers digital editions. But I would say that when Hamilton's final moments come in his duel, and news of that duel kind of trickles through the Adams family, just to give a spoiler, they're not particularly regretful that he's gone. So there is a sense that, he played his role and he played it well, and this was probably where he was headed. So I think that's kind of an interesting bookend to what they make of him.
And where does Alexander Hamilton stand on Alien and Sedition? And I suppose more generally, as there is this kind of crumbling of the Adams administration, or at
Yeah.
least a lot of
I mean,
pressure.
he's going to lash out. So Hamilton's going to take it to print, right? He's going to become someone who attacks Adams' administration in print. Adams will fire back. It will be a back and forth. Alien Sedition, it's interesting because Hamilton is very much focused on the military part of things, and more so what we see in the papers here are more about his interest in how will the Provisional Army work? How can I make sure these people, how it will be structured? Because McHenry, who is a veteran, is a little bit older. And so I think Hamilton really perceives in all of this political mess that's created a chance to finally get what he wants from a military standpoint. So that's where he really focuses in.
And presumably, given his influence, this is something that's going to lead to problems for the Adams administration, to have such an influential such an influential figure, kind of deriding Adams.
Oh yeah, and he's not the only one. I mean, one of the interesting things about the Adams papers is we get in the papers a lot of anonymous hate mail and a lot of death threats, some of which we run. And what I think is interesting about this is that people don't like Adams' French foreign policy at all. But some people really do. So in the summer of 1798, Adams is swamped with what are known as patriotic addresses. And they come from all over, from militias, from philanthropic societies, from activists at college campuses, you name it. And he writes back to all of them. And a lot of them are praising him and his French policy and the state of the country. And he sits down and replies to most of them, which is kind of fun, right? Can you imagine that shortwave dialogue that existed in the 1790s, where if you wrote to the president, he wrote back? He didn't just tweet back, but he thoughtfully composed a reply. And so this is what Adams does. You have this real engagement between the president and the people, between voters and the person in power. And I think that's super interesting. So at first he's super popular in these patriotic addresses. But then after Alien, and we have probably, I would say, since they go from the spring of 1798 to the kind of early 1799, they're published everywhere, probably north of about 500 exchanges. We didn't publish all of them, but we'll hope to make them available. Um, and what we see is this dialogue between Adams and voters. And at first, it's going real well. But after Alien and Sedition, things take a turn, and people use these addresses to express discontent or to talk about the state of the country or where they think politics should go next or how they feel about France and Britain. All of these things they kind of lay out on the table. So Adams starts to get kind of more of the popular view flooding onto his desk than I think he got before. He doesn't always handle it well. What I think is interesting about the anonymous death threats is that he kept them. So think for a moment about what lies in a president's papers. It may or may not be very flattering. It's definitely worth researching because he would read it and he would keep it. And the expectation was his son, John Quincy, who would be president, would have read those papers too. His grandson, who kept the peace with Great Britain during the American Civil War, he read those papers too. And Adams kept those threats and that criticism to say, look, this is what it costs to serve the American people. This is what it costs to be a president and a public servant. So you should know going in what you have to expect. And so some of the threats are wild. A lot of them are from very angry merchants who've lost a lot of money to French privateers. A lot of them are very personal in nature. Sometimes they're people who, are still trying to be compensated for Revolutionary War losses. There's a lot of history that Adams encounters in terms of how people approach him. So people like to talk about their experiences in the Revolution, what they think of the French Revolution, how the Western country has changed. These are all things that kind of get littered throughout the praise and criticism he delivers. Because when you write about the president to the president, you're talking about the whole country.
I suppose all of this really leads up to something we talk about in greater detail next time. But the often cited turning point in US political history, the 1800 presidential election. I mean, given how long we spent talking about the 1796 one, I might have two episodes on 1800. But so presidential rematch, and Adams is, spoiler alert, defeated by his Vice President Jefferson. What are the key, well, I think we can imagine what the key issues are, but I suppose how does this play out? How does this all play out in the public sphere in order for there to be such a kind of a realignment as there is in 1800?
So the election of 1800 is nasty. There's a lot of dragging personalities and scandals and rumors in the press. There's a lot of pitting Adams and Jefferson against each other personally. What there isn't is a lot of campaigning by our major candidates because that's not a thing. So you wouldn't have someone like Adams or Charles Cotesworth Pinckney, who's also right on the ticket. You would not have either of them out there giving stump speeches or firing back at Jefferson in a pamphlet war. You wouldn't have Jefferson or Aaron Burr, who's our other Democratic Republican contender in the lead, talking about them in the press or giving interviews. So it would look a little different. Yet, in many ways, it's considered our first modern election, right? It reboots the political party system. It really crystallizes the camps between who's pro-French, who's pro-British, where we stand on things like domestic insurgency, military acceleration, taxation, alien and sedition. These are the hot button issues. And I think we've talked a little bit about where people would kind of gravitate. The election of 1800 is something that Adams knows he has lost by December of 1799. So not only has Adams lost this election, and he well knows it, he's lost his son Charles, who died a month earlier. He knows that the Federalists as a party are sunk. So there's just a constellation of loss that kind of drags him down. He writes to his son Thomas Boylston, like, my little bark has been upset. Like the storm has completely kind of taken away. This political storm has eclipsed all of my hopes for the next couple of years. Jefferson, however, doesn't outright win, does he? There's a wonderful moment where before they leave the brand new Washington, D.C., Abigail Adams, then the First Lady, although that title won't be in play for a while, um, sits down to a last dinner with Jefferson. This is the last time that the Adamses and Jefferson see each other in person together. They never will again. John Quincy will see Jefferson, but that's it. And so they have this really extraordinary dinner where they talk about politics. And Abigail says, she doesn't know yet if Jefferson has won. It's still tied up in the House between Jefferson and Burr, but she thinks she knows how it's going to tip. And she says, his term will not be a summer sea. Like, it will not be easy to handle anything that he inherits. So the election of 1800 is bitter, it's divisive, it's something that drives apart Adams and Jefferson for some time until they reunite on the page, thanks to Benjamin Rush in 1812. What I find remarkable about the election of 1800's legacy, I've just been skimming some of John Adams' retirement correspondence. That first kind of 8 years while Jefferson is in power, Adams doesn't talk much about Jefferson's presidency on the page. He is respectful. He pulls back. He goes into kind of a self-editing mode. Where he pours out his energy is writing his own autobiography and sort of correcting the record on how he played such a major role in the American Revolution. He doesn't like how it's appeared so far, thanks to Mercy Otis Warren and others. So he writes to the Boston Patriot newspaper. He sends all his recollections. He drafts his autobiography. But he doesn't comment on Jefferson. And he certainly doesn't like what Jefferson is doing. For that, you have to turn to the rest of the Adams family papers and read Abigail's thoughts, or read her daughter Nabby's thoughts, or John Quincy's thoughts. But I find it quite striking that he kind of muzzles himself a little bit. And then once they're reunited, it's very interesting to watch. Like, whenever they sort of, I don't know if you've ever kind of patched up a friendship, you'll know what this feels like. You sort of come right up into a subject that tore you apart once, and you kind of like, I don't know, kind of run away as quickly as you can, like, oh, maybe we shouldn't talk about that. And you see that quite a bit. Adams will poke at Jefferson for something, and Jefferson will kind of poke back. But then they'll be like, oh, maybe we should just leave that in the corner over there and not talk about it. And we could talk about all these other things we've shared. So the legacy of the election of 1800 for the two people who are really at the heart of it, I find just as fascinating as the greater ramifications it had for American politics.
Right, but before we kind of get into those ramifications, perhaps I have a question about. We've spoken a lot about policy, but kind of the role of personality in 1800, because there's this real juxtaposition, isn't there, between Adams and Jefferson as people. And I mean, you must be so familiar with it, reading Adams' correspondence all the time. And if I'm getting the right impression, Adams doesn't strike me as much of a politician or much of a kind of a even presidential personality. It's like he seems to be um quite not he's quite convictious. He's definitely got his strong beliefs, but he's also someone who's perhaps a little bit less bombastic than those around him, or less of a firebrand. Do you think John Adams, is it fair to say that John Adams has a less kind of infectious personality, perhaps, than Thomas Jefferson? And does that harm him at all in 1800?
Josh, I think it's so interesting to compare their personalities, right? Because they're kind of two halves of an Enlightenment soul, right? Thomas Jefferson is all sense. John Adams is all sensation. John Adams talks before he thinks, and he will drown you in arguments and evidence for years if he disagrees with you. Jefferson is a little more distant, academic on the page. I'm always struck that Adams complains to Jefferson that, he writes letters twice as often and 4 times as long, and Jefferson is more concise and constrained in his mode of communication. Neither of them are born politicians. They had promising careers as colonial lawyers before the revolutionary plot twist. But certainly within the Adams clan, the best politician is Abigail, hands down. John Adams is not. Abigail is extremely good at planting newspaper stories, at thinking about the optics of Adams' presidency. She has more of like a White House fixer role than anyone else does. And she thinks about these things. Adams disdains political parties, right? He, from a historical standpoint, doesn't approve of them. He thinks that they will muddy the waters and ruin the Constitution. So you're exactly right that he's not much of a politician, either by plan or by circumstance. Now, Jefferson is something a little different. Jefferson is someone who is very good at using informers well. So, for example, the 1790s, he is eyeing that run for a long time from Monticello. And he has extremely good informers in the shape of, say, James Madison, who are on the scene and are constantly writing to him in terms of Southern mercantile interests and people that he knows. And he has also kind of a same foothold in global intellectual circles and societies like Adams does. So he is someone who is, I think, far more political. I think you're right about that Jefferson sort of takes to it well, a bit more than Adams ever could. Um, Adams' real kind of ace is Abigail. She is someone who is incredibly savvy, and she is someone who actually never really forgives Jefferson. They never really mend fences, which I think is interesting. Uh, but yeah, in terms of the personalities that are afoot, absolutely. And you have so many differences between them, right? In terms of where they're from, in terms of the fact that Jefferson is deeply entrenched in the world of slavery as an enslaver. Adams is let's not. So, I mean, you have some very stark differences between them. You also have a classic rivalry, Massachusetts versus Virginia. The fact that they're able to pull together for the Revolution is amazing. Whether or not that will hold in the years after the peace, as they're both kind of places that are well springs of political talent and also targets of taxation to accommodate those losses from the Revolution, that is a big question. And the rivalry between those two commonwealths is something that is interesting to watch play out on the national stage. So people would have been drawn to that. We're thinking about it from the Adams and Jefferson view, but if you were a voter in 1800 and you were thinking through some of these issues, you would certainly think about, where are these guys from? What have they always stood for? What did they do in the Revolution? Where do they land on my one issue that I really care about, which happens to be Alien and Sedition? If you are voting in Richmond in 1800 for 1800 elections, you are probably thinking like, do I go with the guy who helped author the Virginia resolutions, or do I go with this New Englander I have never heard of who introduced them? And that must have held serious consequences for voters.
I want to hear about John Adams in his post-presidency because he remained an important figure in American public life, even if he was a little bit quiet on the Jefferson presidency in the 8 years after he lost the election. What kind of post-president did John Adams make for? Because he always has an opinion, and I imagine he would have a lot to say about kind of what happened to America in the 26 years of his life after he lost the election. So, how did he kind of define the role of the post-president, I suppose, and what generally, I suppose, what were his thoughts and his activities following the defeat?
So Adams finds, I think, new civic purpose in his retirement. And first of all, the idea that Washington retired, Adams retired, this is a new political model on the world stage, right? This is not a leader who dies or is killed. This is a completely different story where you can leave power and make a peaceful transfer of power to an opposing party and still have a functioning democracy. So that moment where he absolutely recognizes Jefferson's victory, it's a very important one because America doesn't invent the idea of a peaceful transfer of power, but it does very much engrave in the world's mind that we're able to do it. And that's super important. So to him, that's a really big deal that he does that. He's on the 4 a.m. stage out of DC. He's gone. He doesn't stick around for the inauguration. He goes straight to Quincy. And he settles back into family life at Peacefield. He's a father. He's a grandfather. He loves doing that. He sort of nests in his papers, right? So he kind of reads back over things, works on his autobiography, crafts his legacy. He has a ton of visitors, all the way straight through to his final days in July of 1826. He is someone who is always still interested to meet people and talk politics and argue. He engages in correspondence with so many people, probably most notably Benjamin Rush, Benjamin Waterhouse, the Marquis de Lafayette, and also with Thomas Jefferson again. So he manages to reunite with a lot of friends on the page. And as I said before, it's nice to do kind of a flash forward to understand that super crunch time of Franco-American relations in 1798, 99, 1800, because he thinks about it a lot. And he goes back and really underlines his choices and also provides some intelligence that he didn't the first time around, which is great for us as scholars. Is it through kind of a hazy recast of what he'd like it to be? Yes. So I have to be extra critical when I'm reading those sources because I don't always trust his memory or his version of events. But he is incredibly interested in where the country is going, in what some of Jefferson's changes have wrought on the land, how the population and is changing, how Native American relations are going. These are all things he comments on. He's kind of living the life of a retired gentleman scholar. So he has that kind of emeritus professor vibe often in his conversations. He is still a student of government, and he is very happy to take apart anything from a Roman Senate to the Dutch Republic in thinking about ways that the United States could grow and change.
John Adams was only president for 4 years, but it's fair to say I think he leaves quite a big legacy and an interesting one at that. I'm interested to hear from you, Sarah, because I think you like John Adams, or you must like him a bit because you study him so much. But how would you sum up his legacy in light of, I suppose, some of the failures, you might say, of his tenure, particularly the Alien and Sedition Acts?
His daughter-in-law, Louisa Catherine, who married John Quincy, used to say of John Adams, everything in his mind was rich, racy, and true. I think that's kind of the best possible epitaph for him, to be honest with you. I think he is someone who always studied government, always looked to see why republics rise and fall, was incredibly concerned with the United States neutrality and union. Those are the two pillars of the government that are always on his mind and how to keep them as sturdy as possible. He's someone who thought quite a bit about what public service meant, whether you became a diplomat or you were a port collector. What did it mean to be a good servant and to kind of put forth lowercase d democratic principles in your day job? This is something that he really considered, I think, closely, and it's certainly part of the conversations he must have had with his kids, with his wife. You know, how do we do this American thing in terms of a government? What does it mean for our family? So I think that's, as his legacy as a president is complicated because we see, I think, very clearly the personal and the professional and how they can clash and how they can combine for an effective leader. One thing that very much strikes me about Adams in all the years I've read him is that he did not agree with everyone, but he was eager to go outside his bubble. So he took the time to do the reading of the opposition. He would find the pamphlet, he would translate something, he would ask someone about it. If he didn't agree with something immediately, he didn't just shove it aside. I think that's really something we should think about today in terms of civil discourse. So he and Jefferson don't agree about everything. He and Sam Adams, his own cousin, they don't agree about a lot of things in the Constitution right off the bat, but he thinks about ways to approach opposing views, really absorb and interpret them, and then talk about them. So I think that really sticks with me, the idea that if you don't agree with something right off, hold, do the reading, engage with people to learn more.
Sarah, you've once again been fantastic. Thank you for returning.
My pleasure. Thank you so much for having me.
No problem. We're going to put the link to the Adams Papers digital edition in the description so people can check that out if they're interested and look at all the sources that have been digitized. Sarah Georgini is the series editor for the Papers of John Adams, which is part of the Adams Papers project at the Massachusetts Historical Society. And she's also the author of Household Gods, The Religious Lives of the Adams Family. And if you'd like to read more into John Adams and his family, that is available via Oxford University Press. The link will be also in the description. Folks, thank you very much for listening. This has been the Napoleonic Wars podcast. We will be back very soon.
Did you enjoy this episode? Be sure to subscribe so that you can find your way back to us. If you want to stay up to date with all the latest news, sign up to our mailing list. The link is in the description. And don't forget that you can enjoy early access, exclusive episodes, online courses, and much more on Patreon. The link is in the description. And if you're looking for personalized merch for the Napoleonic nerd in your life, drop us a line on social media and we can design something for you. Shout outs to our patrons who, at the time of recording in early June 2025, were in the mentioned in dispatches tier, Brendan Teeling, Beatrice de Graaf, Lynn Dawson, Jim Deary, Josh Keeney, Colin Fieldhouse, Jim Getz, Jeff Maple, Robin Brasher, Indiana Fats, Stephen Gillen, Hugh Brennan, Alistair Campbell-Grieve, Andy Meakin, Mark Anscombe, Rob Coughlin, Bruins Girl, Noah Fink, Miles Reedy, Nick Overland, Graham Goodwin, Chris Pramas, Anthony Gumbel, Anonymous American, James Fluick, Natasha Hobday, Rod Schwager, Chris Kimball, Gary Dennis, Ted Andrews, Richard Anderson, Arthur Forgy, Sam Moore, Wyatt Pollock, Joe Ayres, Darla Vincent, Peter Findlay, Giovanni, Steve Gillen, Jean-Baptiste Van Merlen, Daniel Friedman, Neil Reed, Jonathan Willits, Wojciech Stefanovic, Simon Weathers, and Zach Johnson. The Admirals, Ian Harding, John Haynes, Mike Guest, Rachel Stark, Mark Duckers, David Priest, Graham Callister, Sean Sullivan, Stephen Ashworth, Reto the Sci-Fi Fan, Tim Day, Jason Morn, and Tim Pritchard. The Chiefs of Staff, David Maxwell and Adam Coslin, the Marshals, Ryan Diamond and JC Kaiser, and the Legion of Scholars, Kate Wilcombe, Clemens Beman, Dan Hazelwood, and Bob Burnham, not forgetting in the Crown Yourself tier, Emperor of the First French Empire Todd Campbell, and Duke of Wellington Laird Campbell. We'll be back very soon, but until then, this has been the Napoleonic Wars Pod. On behalf of myself, Liam, Luke, and Josh, take care of yourselves, folks, stay well, and as always, thank you for listening.